27,000 feet above Tokyo, December 3, 1944. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi gripped the control stick of his Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien as his engine coughed, sputtered, and then fell silent. The liquid-cooled Kawasaki Ha-40 inline engine, a copy of a German design, had betrayed him at the worst possible moment. Ahead, a formation of 12 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses droned toward the capital, their silver bodies glinting in the cold winter sun. Any other pilot would have turned back. Kobayashi pushed his nose down and dove straight at the bombers. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary moments in aerial combat history. A single Japanese fighter, its propeller windmilling uselessly in the slipstream, plunging silently through 30,000 feet of freezing sky, completely invisible to American gunners who had been trained to spot the telltale smoke and sound of approaching fighters. The dead engine dive was born not from tactical planning, but from desperation, and it would change how Japanese pilots approached the most heavily defended bombers in history. If you find these stories of aerial combat fascinating, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Now let us return to the skies over Japan in 1944. The B-29 Superfortress represented everything that was terrifying about American industrial power. The aircraft weighed over 60,000 kilograms, fully loaded. It could fly at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet, where most Japanese fighters struggled to even breathe. Its pressurized cabin allowed crews to operate in relative comfort at heights where exposed pilots suffered from hypoxia, frostbite, and disorientation. 4 Wright R-350 duplex Cyclone engines, each producing over 2,200 horsepower, propelled this monster at speeds approaching 350 miles per hour. The defensive armament was equally formidable. 12 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, controlled by a revolutionary centralized fire control system, could be operated remotely by gunners who tracked targets through computerized sighting stations. A single B-29 could put out a devastating cone of fire that covered virtually every approach angle. And they flew in formations designed to create overlapping fields of fire, turning an attack run into a gauntlet of hot lead that few pilots survived. Japanese fighter pilots in late 1944 faced an impossible equation. Their aircraft were designed for maneuverability, not altitude performance. The Nakajima Ki-44, Shoki, and the Mitsubishi A6M0 could not reliably reach the heights where B-29s operated. Even when they managed to claw their way up to 30,000 feet, their engines were gasping for oxygen, their controls sluggish and unresponsive in the thin air. The Americans had created an altitude sanctuary that Japanese defenses simply could not penetrate. The Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien, which Allied pilots codenamed Tony, offered a partial solution. Unlike most Japanese fighters that used air-cooled radial engines, the Hien employed a liquid-cooled inline engine based on the German Daimler-Benz DB601 design. This gave the aircraft a sleeker profile and better high-altitude performance. The Hien could reach altitudes of 37,000 feet, theoretically placing it above the B-29 formations. But theory and reality were very different things over the skies of Japan. The Ha-40 engine that powered the Hien was notoriously unreliable. Japanese manufacturing, stressed beyond capacity by the demands of total war, could not produce the precision components that the engine required. Pilots reported engine failures with alarming frequency, oil leaks, coolant problems, ignition failures. The very engine that made the Hien capable of reaching B-29s also made it vulnerable to mechanical death at the worst possible moments. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi took command of the 244th Sentai in late November 1944. He was only 24 years old, making him the youngest Sentai commander in the entire Imperial Japanese Army Air Force. His unit was assigned to defend Tokyo, the heart of the empire, against the American bomber offensive that everyone knew was coming. The 244th had approximately 40 Ki-61 fighters and had spent months training specifically for B-29 interception. They practiced high-altitude combat. They developed formation tactics. They even mastered night flying, a skill that few Japanese units possessed. Kobayashi himself had an unusual background for a fighter ace. He had started the war as a bomber pilot, flying the obsolete Kawasaki Ki-32 Merry Light bomber during the Battle of Hong Kong in December 1941. He knew what it felt like to fly heavy, sluggish aircraft into hostile skies. He understood the vulnerability of large aircraft to determined fighter attack. When he transitioned to fighters in 1943, he brought a bomber pilot's perspective to the fighter cockpit. The first major B-29 raid on Tokyo came on November 24, 1944. Over 100 Superfortresses from the 21st Bomber Command struck the Nakajima Aircraft Factory at Musashino. Japanese defenders were caught off guard by the sheer altitude and speed of the attackers. Most fighters could not reach the bombers. Those that did found themselves outpaced and outgunned. The Americans lost only one aircraft to fighters. The message was clear: traditional interception tactics would not work. Kobayashi and his pilots analyzed every aspect of the failed interception. The problem was time. By the time a fighter climbed to 30,000 feet, the bombers had already passed overhead. Pursuit from below was futile. The B-29s were simply too fast for a tail chase. The only viable attack profile was from above, diving down through the formation with speed and surprise. But getting above the bombers required climbing to altitudes where the Hien's engine was at its most unreliable. The solution emerged from failure. During a training flight in late November, one of Kobayashi's pilots experienced an engine failure at high altitude. Standard procedure dictated an immediate descent and emergency landing. Instead, the pilot noticed something remarkable. With his engine dead and his propeller feathered, his aircraft became nearly invisible. No exhaust smoke, no engine noise, just a silent shape falling through the sky. B-29 gunners were trained to spot the visual and auditory signatures of attacking fighters. A dead engine eliminated both. The tactic that Kobayashi developed was deceptively simple, but extraordinarily dangerous. His pilots would climb to maximum altitude, above the bomber formations if possible, using every ounce of power their temperamental engines could provide. Then, at the critical moment, they would cut their engines, feather their propellers to reduce drag, and enter a steep dive toward the bombers. The silent approach gave them precious seconds of surprise before the American gunners could react. The physics of the maneuver were brutal. A Ki-61 in a dead engine dive could accelerate to speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, far beyond its normal operational limits. The airframe groaned and shuddered. Control surfaces became heavy and unresponsive. Pilots reported feeling as though the aircraft was trying to tear itself apart around them. Recovery required restarting the engine at lower altitude, a procedure that did not always work, especially with the unreliable Ha-40 power plant. December 3, 1944, marked the debut of the dead engine dive in combat. Kobayashi led the 244th against a formation of B-29s, attacking the Nakajima aircraft plant at Musashino. His engine failed during the climb, a familiar frustration that had plagued the Hien since its introduction. Rather than abort, Kobayashi pushed his silent aircraft into a dive, using gravity as his engine. The American gunners never saw him coming. Kobayashi's first burst of 20mm cannon fire struck the lead bomber's No. 3 engine, sending a spray of oil and debris across the formation. The B-29 staggered, fell out of formation, and began its long spiral toward the Japanese countryside. Kobayashi had scored his first kill, and he had done it in an aircraft that should have been falling out of the sky. The rest of the 244th followed their commander's example. In that single sortie, The unit claimed 6 B-29 kills, an unprecedented achievement for Japanese home defense fighters. Several pilots used ramming attacks, deliberately crashing their fighters into bombers when their ammunition ran out or their guns jammed. Remarkably, all the ramming pilots survived, parachuting to safety after their collisions. The newspapers proclaimed the 244th as heroes. Captain Kobayashi became a national celebrity overnight. The dead engine dive was not without its costs. Pilots who failed to restart their engines had no choice but to bail out or crash. Those who misjudged their approach speed found their aircraft breaking apart in midair. The maneuver required extraordinary nerve, precise timing, and more than a little luck. But for pilots who had watched their comrades die in futile climbing attacks, it offered something precious, a chance to actually reach the enemy. Let us pause here to acknowledge those of you who have been following this channel. If you are enjoying this deep dive into aerial combat history, please consider hitting the like button. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light. Not far from Tokyo, another Japanese pilot was developing his own approach to the B-29 problem. Captain Isamu Kashide of the 4th Sentai flew the Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu, a twin-engine heavy fighter that the Allies called Nick. The Toryu was armed with one 37mm cannon and two 20mm autocannon, giving it the firepower to actually damage the massive American bombers. Kashid believed that frontal attacks offered the best chance of success against the B-29. His reasoning was coldly logical. The B-29's defensive armament was concentrated in its tail and dorsal positions. The front of the aircraft, where the bombardier and pilot sat, had minimal protection. A head-on attack gave the fighter pilot a clear shot at the cockpit, while exposing him to fewer defensive guns. The closure speed was terrifying, over 600 miles per hour combined, but the attack window was brief enough that even the American fire control computers could not track accurately. Kashid first tested his theory during the American raids on Yawata in June 1944. Coming head-on at a B-29 formation, he watched his 37mm shells punch through the nose of the lead bomber. The aircraft shuddered, rolled, and fell. 2 more B-29s went down to Kashid's guns that day, possibly a third. The frontal attack worked. It was dangerous. It required extraordinary precision, but it worked. The key was aiming for the cockpit. Kashid discovered that a single 37mm high-explosive shell in the flight deck would almost certainly eliminate the bomber. The pilots and flight engineer sat in a relatively small enclosed space. One good hit could eliminate all 3, leaving a 60,000-kilogram aircraft with no one at the controls. He trained other pilots in his technique, emphasizing the need for steady nerves and accurate fire at the last possible moment before breaking off. By March 1945, Kashid had claimed 26 B-29 victories, making him the most successful anti-bomber ace in Japanese history. Post-war analysis reduced this number to 7 confirmed kills, but even this figure represented an extraordinary achievement. He flew repeatedly into the teeth of the American bomber formations, where the statistical probability of survival was measured in single missions. Most Japanese fighter pilots who challenged B-29s did not survive their second interception. Kashid flew mission after mission and kept coming back. The combination of Kobayashi's dead engine dive and Kashid's frontal assault created a tactical template that other Japanese units attempted to copy. The concept was straightforward. Use the dive to gain speed and surprise, then press home a frontal attack before the American gunners could react. In practice, the execution was brutally difficult. Japanese pilots faced a fundamental disadvantage that no amount of skill could fully overcome. Their aircraft were simply not designed for high-altitude combat against heavily armed bombers. The Zero, which had dominated the early Pacific War, was helpless above 25,000 feet. The Ki-44 Shoki could reach higher altitudes, but lacked the armament to seriously damage a B-29. Only the Ki-61 Hien and a handful of other types could combine altitude performance with sufficient firepower, and these aircraft were always in short supply. The B-29's turbo-supercharged engines gave it a decisive advantage in the thin air above 30,000 feet. Japanese engineers understood the theory of turbo-supercharging, but could not manufacture the precision components required. Their aircraft used mechanical superchargers that lost efficiency at extreme altitudes. A Japanese fighter climbing to 30,000 feet was operating at the very edge of its performance envelope, while the B-29 cruised comfortably with power to spare. American tactics evolved in response to Japanese attacks. Bomber formations tightened, creating overlapping fields of defensive fire that made approach from any angle hazardous. Fighter escorts, particularly the long-range P-51 Mustang, began accompanying the bombers over Japan in early 1945. Where Japanese pilots had previously faced only bomber defensive guns, they now had to contend with some of the best American fighter pilots flying the finest aircraft in the world. The human toll mounted on both sides. American bomber crews faced the terror of attacks that came without warning, fighters appearing from above in silent, screaming dives. Japanese pilots faced the near certainty of death in their attempts to reach bombers that seemed invulnerable. The 244th Sentai, despite its successes, suffered heavy casualties. Pilots who had been celebrated in newspapers one week were listed as missing the next. January 27, 1945, brought another chapter in Kobayashi's war. Leading his unit against a B-29 formation, he entered a diving attack on a bomber from the 498th Bomb Group. His guns fired, striking the American aircraft. Then something went wrong. Whether his aircraft was hit by defensive fire or suffered another engine failure, Kobayashi's Hien collided with the B-29. The fighter pilot managed to bail out, parachuting to safety with only minor bruises. The bomber, trailing smoke and debris, spiraled down to crash in the Japanese countryside. It was his third confirmed B-29 kill. The ramming attack was not planned. Kobayashi always insisted that he intended to pull away after his firing pass, but the collision illustrated a grim reality of Japanese air defense. Sometimes the only way to ensure a bomber went down was to physically crash into it. Other pilots in the 244th had already demonstrated this on December 3rd. The ramming attacks continued throughout the winter and spring of 1945. The Japanese military formalized ramming as a tactical option, though it was never made mandatory. Special units were organized, their aircraft stripped of unnecessary weight to improve climb performance. Pilots were told that their sacrifice would defend the homeland, that each B-29 destroyed represented thousands of Japanese lives saved from the fire raids. Some pilots volunteered, others were assigned to ramming units with little choice in the matter. The line between conventional combat and suicide attack blurred as the war situation deteriorated. Kobayashi and the 244th continued conventional attacks whenever possible. The captain believed that a skilled pilot could achieve more by surviving multiple missions than by sacrificing himself in a single ramming attack. His experience on January 27th reinforced this view. He had destroyed a B-29 and lived to fight again. Other pilots in his unit studied his techniques, practicing the dead engine dive in training flights over the Japanese countryside. Spring 1945 brought new challenges. American tactics shifted from high-altitude precision bombing to low-altitude incendiary raids. The B-29s came in at night, dropping below 10,000 feet to shower Japanese cities with fire. The altitude change made interception theoretically easier, but introduced new problems. Night fighting required specialized training and equipment that most Japanese units lacked. The 244th was one of the few home defense units that had practiced night operations. The fire raids devastated Japan, Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe. City after city burned in the American campaign to destroy Japanese war production and civilian morale. On March 9th and 10th, 1945, over 300 B-29s attacked Tokyo at low altitude. The resulting firestorm eliminated 16 square miles of the city and caused approximately 100,000 deaths. Japanese night fighters achieved limited success against the raiders, but they could not stop the destruction. Kobayashi was wounded in April 1945 during an attack on a B-29 formation. Defensive fire struck his Hien, and shell fragments lodged in his leg. He managed to parachute to safety, his second bailout in 3 months. The wound forced him out of combat temporarily, but he returned to flying as soon as he could walk. There was no question of remaining grounded, while his unit continued to fight. In May 1945, the 244th began receiving the new Kawasaki Ki-100 Gushikisen, an improved fighter that solved many of the Hien's problems. The Ki-100 used a more reliable Mitsubishi Ha-112 radial engine, eliminating the cooling system issues that had plagued the Ha-40. Performance was similar to the Hien, but the aircraft was far more dependable. Pilots who had struggled with engine failures suddenly found themselves flying machines that worked. The Ki-100 proved itself in one of the most dramatic engagements of the Japanese home defense campaign. On July 25, 1945, American F-6F Hellcats from VF-31, operating from the carrier Belleau Wood, attacked Japanese airfields in the Yokkaichi area. Kobayashi's unit had been ordered to stand down and await incoming bombers. The young major disobeyed. Kobayashi led his pilots into the air to engage the Hellcats in a swirling dogfight that descended to hangar-top height. The 244th claimed 10 Hellcat victories, though post-war analysis showed both sides actually lost 2 aircraft each. The newspapers celebrated the action. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force Command was less pleased. Kobayashi faced court-martial for disobeying orders, a charge that carried severe penalties. Word of the engagement reached Emperor Hirohito. The sovereign expressed approval of Kobayashi's aggressive defense of Japanese airspace. The court-martial was dropped. Major Kobayashi received the second-class Bukosho Medal and continued to lead the 244th until the end of the war. If you have made it this far into the story, you clearly appreciate detailed military history. Please take a moment to subscribe if you have not already, and share this video with anyone who might be interested in these remarkable accounts of aerial combat. The final months of the war brought only more desperation. American air superiority became absolute. P-51 Mustangs swept the skies ahead of bomber formations, hunting down Japanese fighters before they could reach their targets. B-29s flew with near impunity, their losses dropping to fractions of a percent per mission. The defensive tactics that Kobayashi and Kashidi had developed remained effective in individual engagements, but they could not change the overall strategic picture. Japanese industry was collapsing under the weight of American bombing. Aircraft production fell sharply as factories were destroyed and supply chains disrupted. Pilots received less training as fuel became scarce. The quality of replacement aircraft deteriorated as manufacturers used inferior materials and unskilled labor. By summer 1945, many Japanese air units could barely field operational aircraft. The atomic bombs that devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought the war to its end. Japan surrendered on August 15th. For Kobayashi and the surviving pilots of the 244th, the war was over. They had defended their homeland with everything they had. They had developed tactics that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in aerial combat. They had not been able to stop the bombers. Isamu Kashid survived the war and lived quietly in his hometown of Kashiwazaki until his death in May 2003 at the age of 88. In September 1985, he met Raymond F. Halloran, the navigator of the B-29 he had shot down over Tokyo in January 1945. Halloran had parachuted from his burning aircraft and survived as a prisoner of war. The two men shook hands, former enemies who had found peace 40 years after trying to end each other's lives. Teruhiko Kobayashi's post-war path was different. He worked in the civilian sector for 9 years after the surrender, then joined the newly created Japan Air Self-Defense Force in 1954. He received training in the United States on the F-86 Saberjet fighter, learning to fly the aircraft that represented the cutting edge of 1950s aviation technology. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel. On June 4, 1957, Kobayashi was flying a T-33 Shooting Star jet trainer from Hamamatsu Air Base when a technical problem occurred shortly after takeoff. He ordered his co-pilot to eject, then attempted to steer the crippled aircraft away from populated areas. The jet crashed before he could escape. Teruhiko Kobayashi was 36 years old. He had survived countless combats against American bombers and fighters, only to die in a training accident during peacetime. The dead engine dive that Kobayashi helped pioneer represented something larger than a simple tactical innovation. It embodied the desperation and determination of pilots who faced impossible odds with insufficient equipment and still found ways to fight. Japanese aviation historians have debated the technique's effectiveness. Some argue that it provided a genuine tactical advantage against B-29 formations. Others contend that any success attributed to the maneuver was due to individual pilot skill rather than the approach method itself. What remains undeniable is the courage required to execute the maneuver. A pilot who cut his engine at 30,000 feet was betting his life on his ability to restart it at lower altitude, or on the slim chance that he could successfully bail out from a diving aircraft. Many pilots who attempted the dead engine dive did not survive. Their names are largely forgotten, overshadowed by the larger narrative of Japanese defeat. The B-29 represented the industrial might that would define modern air warfare. No amount of individual heroism could overcome the advantage that mass production, advanced technology, and superior resources provided. American factories produced over 3,800 B-29s during the war. Japanese factories struggled to maintain the fighters already in service. The outcome was never really in doubt. Yet within this larger pattern of inevitable defeat, individual stories of skill and courage emerge. Kobayashi and Kashid fought not because they believed they could win the war, but because they could not accept doing nothing while their homeland burned. They developed tactics that pushed their obsolete aircraft to the limits of performance. They led men into combat against overwhelming odds. They survived when survival seemed impossible again and again, until finally their luck ran out or the war ended. The legacy of the dead engine dive extends beyond World War II. Post-war analysis of Japanese air defense tactics influenced both American and Soviet doctrine for bomber defense. The concept of using gravity to achieve approach speeds beyond normal aircraft performance appeared in various forms throughout the Cold War. Modern stealth technology addresses the same fundamental problem that Kobayashi faced: how to approach a defended target without being detected. For the men who flew those missions, legacy was less important than immediate survival. Every takeoff could be the last. Every engagement brought the possibility of death by enemy fire, mechanical failure, or simple miscalculation. They measured success not in grand strategic terms, but in bombers destroyed, comrades saved, missions completed. The dead engine dive gave them one more tool in a desperately limited arsenal. The skies over Japan in 1944 and 45 witnessed some of the most intense aerial combat in history. American technological superiority met Japanese determination in engagements where the outcome of individual fights mattered less than the grinding attrition that slowly but surely eliminated Japanese defensive capability. Within this larger pattern, pilots like Kobayashi and Kashidi carved out moments of tactical success that demonstrated what human skill and courage could achieve even against impossible odds. The dead engine dive was never a war-winning tactic. It was a desperate adaptation by pilots who had been given inadequate tools and told to defend the indefensible. That they found a way to make it work, even briefly, even with terrible losses, speaks to the fundamental human capacity for innovation under pressure. They could not stop the bombers, they could not save their cities, but they could choose how they faced their impossible task, and they chose to face it with ingenuity and courage. Teruhiko Kobayashi's 5 confirmed victories seem modest compared to the great aces of other air forces, but each of those victories represented a moment when a single pilot in a failing aircraft defied the odds and brought down an enemy that should have been invulnerable. 3 B-29 Superfortresses, each crewed by 11 men, each carrying enough bombs to devastate a city block. 2 F-6F Hellcats, each flown by a trained American pilot. 5 victories earned through skill, determination, and a willingness to push his aircraft and himself beyond all reasonable limits. The dead engine dive died with the war that created it. Modern jet aircraft operate on entirely different principles. But the spirit of tactical innovation, of finding unexpected solutions to overwhelming challenges, continues wherever pilots face combat. Kobayashi and his men wrote one small chapter in the larger history of aerial warfare. Their story deserves to be remembered not as a tale of futile resistance, but as a testament to what determined individuals can achieve when they refuse to accept defeat. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the history of the Japanese home defense pilots and their desperate battles against the B-29 Superfortress. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you will not miss our next exploration of forgotten military history. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on these remarkable pilots and their innovative tactics. Until next time, remember that history is written not by those who simply witnessed events, but by those who dared to act when action seemed impossible.